The sound was not an animal. It was a faint, fragile cry coming from the deepest shadows of the hayloft. On a cold November morning in 1987, a lonely Iowa farmer named Walter Briggs followed that whimper. He pushed aside bales of alfalfa, and there, wrapped in a thin blanket, was a newborn baby girl. In that solitary barn, a decision made in a heartbeat would forge a bond that, 18 years later, would mean the difference between life and death. Walter was a solitary man, his world defined by the silence of his fields. He had no family, no blueprint for what to do next. But in that moment, holding a child the world had discarded, his purpose became clear. He would raise her as his own. He named her Ilara. This is the story of how that abandoned infant, forged in the hardship of a remote farm, would one day face the ultimate test, to use her hardened skills to save the only father she had ever known. The first years were a symphony of improvisation. A bottle warmed on the wood stove, diapers fashioned from clean feed sacks. Walter, a man who spoke more to his tractor than to people, now filled the quiet farmhouse with lullabies and bedtime stories read from his old almanac. He filed no official paperwork. In his mind, the law had no place in a moment of mercy. She was simply his daughter, Ilara, a gift left in the hay. Their life was one of gentle rhythm. Ilara learned to walk between rows of corn. She could diagnose a sick calf by the age of 7, her small hand resting on its flank, mirroring Walter's practiced touch. But a different kind of diagnosis began to fascinate her. She devoured Walter's old human anatomy book, a relic from his brief, abandoned college dream. She would point to the intricate illustrations of the heart. "This is his aortic valve, Papa. If it gets sticky, he gets tired," she'd say, referring to their agging horse. Walter would just watch, a quiet awe growing in his chest. His little girl saw the world as a puzzle of interconnected systems, and she was determined to understand every piece. The outside world, however, was not their farm. When Ilara turned 6, Walter attempted to enroll her in the local school. He had no birth certificate for her, only a handwritten note he'd crafted himself. The principal, a stern man named Higgins, looked from the note to Walter's weathered face. "Mr. Briggs, we can't accept this. This isn't a legal document. Where are the adoption papers, the court orders?" Walter's silence spoke volumes. A fear he'd buried for years surfaced, the fear that his righteous act could be seen as a crime, that the state could take her away. He left the office, holding Ilara's hand tightly. From that day, her classroom became the farm, and Walter, alongside library books ordered by mail, became her teacher. Their bond was their fortress, but it was built on a foundation of a single, fragile secret. Ilara knew she was found. Walter had never lied. But the why and the who were shadows they never chased. For Ilara, it was enough. Walter was her father in every way that mattered. Yet that secret created an invisible wall around their 100 acres. They rarely went to town. They trusted few people. Their life, while full of love, was also a life of quiet isolation, a choice Walter made to protect the family he'd built from nothing. Ilara's intellect was a flame that couldn't be contained by the farm. By 16, she was correcting the veterinary manuals. She saved a lamb via crude field surgery Walter could only watch with held breath. That night she told him her dream. "I want to be a surgeon, Papa, a real one, for people." The cost was astronomical. Medical school was a world of privilege, a world away from their rusted pickup and paid-off mortgage. Walter simply nodded. He mortgaged the back 40 acres he'd inherited from his own father, land he'd sworn he'd never touch. The loan officer asked the purpose of the funds. "My daughter's education," Walter said, his voice leaving no room for further questions. Getting into college required a legal identity. This was the cliff they had avoided for 18 years. With a pro bono lawyer from a city church group, Walter embarked on a terrifying legal journey. He had to petition the court for formal adoption, presenting his case to a judge. He brought Ilara's homemade transcripts, her awards from national correspondence competitions, and neighbors who swore to the life he'd given her. The county, facing an unusual case with an undeniably positive outcome, ultimately agreed to a rare, late-stage adoption and creation of a birth certificate. The judge looked at Walter. "Mr. Briggs, you understand this makes you legally and irrevocably her father." Walter's eyes filled. "Your Honor, I've been that since the day I heard her cry." Ilara thrived at university. She was a curiosity, the farm girl with calloused hands who aced organic chemistry. She called Walter every Sunday, her voice buzzing with terms like mitochondria and suture techniques. He'd listen, understanding little of the science but everything about the passion in her voice. He worked harder, the farm now a tuition-paying machine. The years began to wear on him in a new way, a shortness of breath he blamed on dust. A deep fatigue he attributed to long days. He hid it all from Ilara during her infrequent visits. Her dream was too close, he wouldn't be the anchor that held her back. Then came the acceptance letter to medical school. It was her ticket to the future, and it was 1,000 miles away. The night before she left, they sat on the porch. "You gave up everything for me," Ilara said, her voice thick. Walter looked out at his darkened fields. "I had nothing until I found you, Ilara. This was all for us." She left at dawn. The farmhouse echoed with a silence deeper than Walter remembered. Act 1 ends here. In the city, Ilara dove into the grueling world of medical training, her farmer's work ethic making her a star. Back on the farm, Walter's secret fatigue blossomed into something terrifying. One afternoon, while repairing a fence alone, a crushing pain exploded in his chest, radiating down his arm. He collapsed into the dirt, the sky spinning above him. He was found hours later by a worried feed deliveryman. Rushed to the local county hospital, the diagnosis was dire, a massive heart attack with severe damage to the muscle. They stabilized him, but the small hospital couldn't perform the complex bypass surgery he needed. His only chance was transfer to the regional cardiac center, the very hospital where Ilara was just beginning her third-year clinical rotations. As Walter drifted in and out of consciousness in the ambulance speeding toward the city, one name was on his lips. And in a crowded hospital hallway, a young medical student named Ilara Briggs was about to be paged to the emergency intake desk for a new patient case, completely unaware that the life hanging in the balance was the only life that had ever truly mattered to her. The page crackled over the hospital intercom with a sterile urgency. "Medical student Briggs to emergency intake. Student Briggs to emergency intake." Ilara, who had been reviewing cardiac enzyme charts, felt a familiar jolt of adrenaline. Another learning case. She hurried through the fluorescent-lit corridors, mentally preparing for a gunshot wound, a car accident, a diabetic crisis. She pushed through the swinging doors into the controlled chaos of the ER intake. A nurse thrust a clipboard at her. "Ambulance inbound, ETA 2 minutes. Male, late 50s, massive MI transferred from Laurel County. They've got him stable-ish, but he needs a triple bypass yesterday. You're on intake history. Get whatever you can from the paramedics." Ilara nodded, her pen poised. The ambulance bay doors hissed open and the gurney rattled in, surrounded by a whirlwind of personnel. Ilara moved forward, her eyes scanning the patient's pale, ashen face, the oxygen mask, the tangle of wires. Her professional detachment lasted precisely 3 seconds. World narrowed to a tunnel. The beeping monitors faded into a dull roar. The man on the gurney had a shock of familiar gray hair, now matted with sweat. His hand, lying limp on the sheet, bore the same distinctive scar across the knuckles from a long-ago tangle with barbed wire. It was a hand that had held hers, taught her to tie a knot, brushed tears from her cheeks. "Papa," the word escaped her lips, a whisper lost in the medical din. Walter's eyes, clouded with pain and medication, fluttered open. They found hers, a flicker of recognition, then profound regret. He tried to speak, his voice a ragged breath against the plastic mask. "Ilara didn't want to trouble you." The medical team surged forward, rolling him toward the cardiac intensive care unit. Ilara stood frozen, the clipboard hanging uselessly at her side. The nurse who'd handed it to her glanced back. "Briggs, you with us? We need that history." The command snapped her back, but into a different person. The detached student was gone. This was a daughter fighting for her father's life. She sprinted after the gurney, her mind clicking into a terrifying new gear. She knew his history better than any chart. No known allergies, no prior surgeries, a lifetime of hard labor, the fatigue he'd hidden for months. In the CICU, a wall of resistance met her. Dr. Evans, the attending cardiothoracic surgeon, was a man of protocol and icy competence. He looked at Ilara, still in her short white coat denoting her student status, hovering at the foot of her father's bed. "Miss Briggs, you need to wait outside. You cannot be involved in this case. It's a direct conflict of interest." Ilara's voice shook, but it was clear. "I'm not here as a student right now, Dr. Evans. I am his medical proxy. He has no one else, and I have his entire medical history in my head." She recited it, the hidden shortness of breath, the episodes of dizziness he'd dismissed, the family history of heart disease he'd once mentioned about his own father. The surgeon listened, his expression unreadable. The tests confirmed the worst. The heart attack had devastated Walter's left anterior descending artery, the so-called widowmaker. The muscle was dying. He needed a multi-vessel coronary artery bypass graft, and he needed it within hours. But there was a complication. Walter's blood work revealed a rare platelet issue, a potential bleeding risk that made surgery exceptionally dangerous. The anesthesiologist balked. The surgical fellow murmured about catastrophic hemorrhage. Dr. Evans looked at the scans, then at Ilara. The risk is substantial. We could lose him on the table. Ilara felt the walls of the hospital close in. This institution, this temple of knowledge she revered, was telling her to prepare for her father's death. She looked at Walter, now sedated but restless, his strong farmer's body looking suddenly small and fragile amid the technology. She remembered the lamb, the crude field surgery, his trusting eyes watching her small, determined hands. A defiant thought, insane and brilliant, cut through the panic. She knew his anatomy. She had studied cardiovascular surgery with a ferocity bordering on obsession. She had assisted on 3 bypass procedures just last month, but to even think it was professional suicide. She approached Dr. Evans again, this time in the quiet hallway. There's another way. The bleeding risk is tied to the standard pump. What about an off-pump procedure? You operate on the beating heart. Dr. Evans stared at her. That's an extremely technically demanding variant, Miss Briggs. Fewer surgeons are proficient. It's not the standard of care for this presentation. But it reduces the bleeding risk by over 60%, Ilara fired back, quoting a recent study verbatim. You're proficient. I've seen your published papers. For the first time, the surgeon's mask of detachment slipped, revealing a flicker of surprise. This student wasn't just emotional, she was clinically sharp, and she was fighting with the only weapons she had, knowledge. Didn't agree, but he didn't say no. He ordered more tests, a specialized coagulation panel that would buy a few more hours. If this panel comes back favorable, we'll consider the off-pump approach. But my team, my hands, he stated firmly. Ilara nodded, a fragile hope taking root. Those few hours became an agony of waiting. She sat by Walter's bed, holding his hand, whispering to him about the farm, about the first calf she'd ever named, about the way the sunrise hit the east field. She was battling on 2 fronts, the medical bureaucracy and the ticking clock of necrosis in her father's heart. Then the second crisis hit. Dr. Evans was called into an emergency, a aortic dissection in the OR that would take him and his primary team out of commission for a minimum of 6 hours. Walter didn't have 6 hours. The new attending surgeon on duty, Dr. Vance, reviewed the case. He was older, more conservative. He looked at the risky blood work and the complex surgical plan. He shook his head. It's too high risk. We manage him medically. We don't have the surgical bandwidth for a Hail Mary procedure tonight. Medical management meant drugs and hope, a death sentence for the amount of damage Walter had sustained. Ilara felt the hope shatter. She stood in the hallway watching Dr. Vance walk away, the sound of his retreating footsteps final. In that moment of utter despair, the hospital administrator, a Mr. Phillips, approached her. He had heard of the interesting case and the conflicted student. His concern was not medicine, but liability. Miss Briggs, he said, his tone politely grave. I must remind you that any attempt to interfere with the treating physician's decisions or any action you take yourself would result in immediate expulsion from this program and likely permanent revocation of your medical license before you even get one. You are to remain in the family waiting area. That is all. He left her there, utterly alone. The system had spoken. Protocol and risk aversion had overruled the unique reality of the man in the bed. Ilara walked back to Walter's room, her mind a storm. She looked at the monitors, the steady, weak beat of his heart tracing a green line on the screen. Each beat was a countdown. She thought of the hayloft, of the man who chose a lifetime of responsibility in a single moment. He had never followed the rules to save her. He had made his own. A quiet, terrifying resolve settled over her. It was not a decision, but an inevitable conclusion, as natural as breathing. She waited for the shift change, for the momentary lull in the hallway traffic. She slipped into the supply room adjacent to the CICU. Her hands, which had once sutured a lamb's artery with fishing line, now gathered what she needed from the locked cabinets, using a code she'd observed a harried resident use weeks ago. She took only the bare essentials. This was not a full operating theater. This would be a field surgery in a sterile box. She returned to Walter's room, locked the door from the inside, and disabled the remote monitoring alarm for his bedside station, a trick she'd learned during a tech seminar. The room was silent except for the beep of the heart monitor and the hiss of the oxygen. She stood over her father, her tools on a sterile tray beside her. The scope of what she was about to attempt, a illegal, unsupervised, and impossibly complex surgical procedure on a beating heart, was enough to paralyze a world-class surgeon. But Ilara Briggs was not just a surgeon in this moment. She was a daughter repaying a debt written 18 years ago in hay and desperation. She picked up the scalpel, her hand perfectly steady. Outside the door, the routine sounds of the hospital continued, oblivious to the miracle and the crime unfolding just on the other side of the glass. The first incision was a whisper of steel against skin. Ilara's world dissolved into a hyper-focused tunnel of blood vessels, muscle, and the rhythmic, terrifying throb of her father's heart. There was no panic, only a profound and eerie calm. Her hands moved with a precision born of 1,000 hours of study and a lifetime of fixing broken things. This was just another repair, she told herself, the most important repair of her life. She worked with agonizing slowness, using the minimally invasive tools she'd scavenged. Each movement was a calculated risk. She bypassed the first blocked vessel, grafting a segment of a healthy artery from Walter's chest wall. The heart beat against her instruments, a living, quivering obstacle. One slip, 1 millimeter too deep, and she would puncture the ventricle. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but she dared not wipe it. Time lost meaning. The only clock was the steady beep of the monitor, a sound she willed to remain constant. Then the complication she feared. A small vessel, weakened by the attack, began to leak. A trickle of blood welled up, obscuring her field of vision. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was the bleeding risk made real. She had seconds to control it. With a grace that defied the circumstances, she placed a tiny vascular clip, her fingers steady as stone. The leak stopped. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding and proceeded, the procedure now a high-wire act over a canyon. Outside the room, the world was waking up. A nurse named Gina, making her rounds, noticed the flatline data from Walter's monitor on the central station. Assuming a faulty sensor, she walked to the room. The door was locked, a red flag. She peered through the window and her hand flew to her mouth. Inside, a medical student in a blood-spattered coat was performing open-heart surgery. Gina sprinted to the nurse's station, triggering a code green, a security and administrative emergency. Within minutes, the hallway outside Walter's room was a storm of shouting administrators, bewildered security guards, and horrified physicians. Dr. Vance and Mr. Phillips, the administrator, arrived, their faces masks of pure outrage. "Break it down," Phillips ordered. But Dr. Evans, just returning from his marathon surgery, pushed through the crowd. He saw Ilara through the glass, her complete concentration, the sophisticated work in progress. He held up a hand. "Wait. You can't be serious," Vance spat. "She's butchering him." "No," Evans said, his voice low with clinical awe. "Look, that's an off-pump multi-vessel graft, and it's technically perfect." He turned to the security chief. "Do not breach that door, not until she's finished. You will kill the patient." An unthinkable standoff ensued. The hospital's legal protocol demanded they stop a criminal act. Medical ethics demanded they not interrupt a critical, life-saving procedure already in motion. They waited, a silent, tense audience to a medical miracle and felony. Inside, Ilara was suturing the final graft. She was reaching her physical and mental limit, her arms trembling from the sustained, delicate effort. With the last knot tied, she inspected her work. Blood flowed through the new bypass channels. The heart's rhythm, which had grown erratic during the procedure, steadied into a strong, regular beat. She had done it. She stepped back, her body suddenly heavy, the adrenaline receding like a tide. Only then did she see the crowd of faces at the window. The door clicked open from the outside. Dr. Evans had used a master key. The room flooded with people. Ilara didn't resist as two security officers took her by the arms. She kept her eyes on Walter, on the steady rise and fall of his chest. Dr. Evans went immediately to the patient, checking the monitors, then leaning in to examine the surgical site. He was silent for a long time. He looked at Ilara, his expression incomprehensible. Then he gave a single, slow nod. It was not approval, but acknowledgement of an impossible achievement. The fallout was swift and brutal. Ilara was taken to the hospital's security office. Her white coat was removed. Mr. Phillips recited the charges: gross misconduct, practicing medicine without a license, theft of medical supplies, criminal endangerment. She was expelled from the medical school program effective immediately. The police were called. As she was led out in handcuffs past the staring hospital staff, the story was already metastasizing. A nurse had posted a blurred, frantic video. The headline wrote itself: "Rogue med student performs illegal surgery to save father." The media frenzy was instantaneous. Satellite trucks lined the street outside the hospital. The story split public opinion in two. One side saw a heroic daughter, a modern-day Frankenstein who broke the rules to save a life. The other saw a dangerous vigilante, a privileged student who thought she was above the law. Talk shows debated it. Legal analysts dissected the felonies she could face, up to 20 years in prison. The hospital, to protect itself, issued a statement condemning her reckless and criminal actions and emphasizing that patient safety was their highest priority. Walter woke up 2 days later, weak but alive. His first word was her name. A nurse, her expression pitying, told him his daughter had saved his life, but she was in jail. Walter tried to get out of bed, tubes and wires pulling at him. He demanded to see her, to see the administrator, to see anyone who would listen. From his hospital bed, he gave a tearful, furious interview to a local reporter, his farmer's hands gripping the sheets. She didn't break the law. She honored a promise. I found her in a barn, and she found me in this hospital. That's the only law that matters. His interview went viral. It changed the narrative. The story was no longer just about a medical student. It was about an abandoned baby, a farmer's love, and a full-circle rescue. A national petition for her pardon garnered millions of signatures. Donations poured in for her legal defense, but the institutional wheels kept turning. The district attorney, facing public pressure but bound by the stark facts of the case, proceeded with charges. Ilara, out on bail, was a pariah in the medical world. Her dream was ashes. She returned to the farm to wait for her trial, the place where it all began. She and Walter sat at the old kitchen table, the silence between them filled with too much. He blamed himself. She reassured him she'd do it again, but the weight of her sacrificed future was a third presence in the room. Then a letter arrived. It was from the State Medical Board. Ilara assumed it was the formal notice of her permanent exclusion from the profession. She opened it with numb fingers. It was an invitation, a formal hearing, not just about her crimes, but about her unprecedented situation. The board, influenced by the public outcry and Walter's recovery, was considering a novel question. Could extreme, proven necessity and an indisputably positive outcome ever justify a breach of medical law? They wanted to hear her case, and Walter's, in person. It was a glimmer, a single thread of hope. But to pull it, she would have to stand before the very architects of the rules she shattered and convince them that sometimes the right thing looks exactly like a crime. And waiting in the hearing room would be Dr. Evans, the surgeon who had watched her work. He would be called as an expert witness. He held her future in his hands, and Ilara had no idea if he saw a hero, a criminal, or the most gifted student he had ever seen throw her life away. The day of the hearing dawned, gray and cold. As they drove to the state capitol, Walter reached over and took her hand, the same way he had on her first day of school. They walked into the imposing government building together, ready to face the final judgment on the life they had built from nothing. The hearing room was a chamber of polished wood and heavy silence. 5 members of the State Medical Board sat elevated behind a long bench, their faces unreadable. To one side sat the hospital's legal team and Mr. Phillips, representing the weight of institutional rules. On the other, Ilara and Walter, accompanied by a single pro bono attorney. In the back row, Dr. Evans watched, his expression inscrutable. The board's chairman, an elderly physician with stern eyes, opened proceedings by stating their purpose: to determine if Ilara Briggs's medical license, currently voided, should be permanently revoked, and to advise the district attorney on the criminal case. The hospital's lawyer spoke first, methodically laying out the charges. He presented the stolen supplies, the locked door, the disabled monitor. He called it a premeditated, arrogant assault on medical ethics and the law. He played the nurse's frantic video. In the quiet room, the image of Ilara bending over her father's exposed heart was shocking, even to her. Then it was Ilara's turn. Her attorney advised her to express remorse, to plead for mercy based on extenuating circumstances. Ilara stood, her hands clasped to stop their trembling. She looked not at the board, but at Walter, then at Dr. Evans. "I cannot express remorse for saving my father's life," she began, her voice clear, "but I am deeply sorry for breaking the trust of the hospital that trained me. I did not act because I thought I knew better than the system. I acted because the system had run out of time for him." She walked the board through that night minute by minute, the Dennead surgery, the bleeding risk, the departing surgeon, the administrator's warning. She presented Walter's current medical charts, showing his strong recovery and the patency of her grafts, verified by independent scans. "I did not see a patient in bed 7. I saw my father, who taught me that when a living thing is suffering, you don't wait for permission to help. You just help." The board members listened, taking notes. Then they called Walter. He walked slowly to the stand, still frail. He told them about the hayloft, about the choice that defied legality for the sake of humanity. "You're looking at what she did in one night," he said, his voice cracking. "But I'm asking you to look at what she did with every night of the 18 years I gave her. She became this. For me, because of me. If that's a crime, then I'm guilty too." Finally, they called Dr. Evans. The hospital's lawyer preened, expecting the respected surgeon to condemn her. Evans adjusted his glasses and looked at the board. "I have reviewed the surgical notes, the post-operative imaging, and the patient's outcome. The procedure performed by Miss Briggs was a technically masterful off-pump coronary artery bypass graft. In my professional opinion, it is the specific reason Mr. Briggs is alive today. Had we waited for my availability or proceeded with the conservative approach, he would have suffered catastrophic further heart damage and likely died." A murmur went through the room. He continued, "What she did was illegal. It was a violation of every protocol we hold sacred. And yet the outcome is indistinguishable from, and in some metrics superior to, the best care this hospital could have provided. This board must decide what matters more, the unwavering adherence to process or the undeniable preservation of a human life when the process failed." The chairman called for a recess. The deliberation lasted 3 hours. For Ilara and Walter, it was an eternity. When they reconvened, the chairman's face was grave. "This board finds itself navigating a chasm between ethics and outcomes, between law and justice. We cannot condone the actions taken. However, we cannot ignore the result, nor the extraordinary circumstances that led a promising student to such a desperate act." He then read the decision. The board would not recommend criminal charges to the district attorney, citing unique and profound mitigating circumstances. They would, however, uphold her expulsion from her medical school. And here he paused. They would not bar her from reapplying to medical licensure in the future, provided she completed a sanctioned, accredited medical degree program again from the beginning. It was a brutal compromise. Her dream was not dead, but it was sent back to zero. Ilara felt the verdict like a physical blow. 4 years of work gone, she would be 30 before she could practice. Walter put his arm around her. "We'll start over," he whispered, "just like we always do." But the story wasn't over. As they gathered their things, Dr. Evans approached. He ignored Ilara and spoke directly to Walter. "Mr. Briggs, how would you feel about a second opinion on your recovery?" Puzzled, Walter agreed. Evans then turned to Ilara. "And you, Miss Briggs, how would you like a job?" He explained. He was leaving the hospital to become the director of a new, cutting-edge rural surgical initiative, a program designed to bring advanced surgical training to doctors serving remote areas. "We need people who understand that sometimes the textbook doesn't reach where the patient is. What you did was wrong in a city hospital. But in a field clinic 100 miles from nowhere, with no backup, that kind of decisive, independent skill isn't criminal. It's essential. I can't give you back your old spot, but I can offer you a paid surgical technician position in my program with a guaranteed seat in the affiliated physician assistant school, a 2-year accelerated path to practicing medicine. It's not being a surgeon, not yet, but it's a scalpel back in your hand." It was a lifeline from the last person she expected, a path forward that valued the very instinct that had broken her. Ilara accepted. Final surprise came a month later. A social worker from the county, having seen the news, visited the farm. She carried an old sealed file. When you were found, Mr. Briggs, the sheriff's department did a minimal inquiry. It was a different time. She handed Walter the file. Inside was a single faded note pinned to the blanket Ilara had been wrapped in. It had been kept as evidence and forgotten. Walter, his hands shaking, read the elegant, desperate script aloud. Her name is Ilara. Please love her, I cannot, forgive me. It was signed with a single initial, E. For Ilara, it was the first piece of a puzzle she had stopped trying to solve. It wasn't an answer, but it was an acknowledgement. She had been named, and she had been loved, if only for a moment. She looked at Walter, the man who had chosen to love her for a lifetime. The circle was complete. 2 years later, Ilara stood in a bright clinic in a remote Appalachian community, a certified physician assistant. She was assisting in a complex emergency procedure. Her hands were steady, her knowledge hard-won. Walter, healthy and robust, volunteered at the clinic, fixing equipment and telling stories to nervous patients. They had moved their life to serve a place not unlike the one that had forged them. One evening, as they closed the clinic, Walter placed a worn, blue-covered book in her hands. It was the old anatomy book from the farm. "I think you've outgrown it," he said, smiling. Inside the front cover, he had written, "For my daughter, who learned to fix hearts long before she held a scalpel. Love, Papa." Ilara's journey from hayloft to operating room was not the straight line she had dreamed of. It was a winding path of defiance, sacrifice, and redemption. She learned that saving a life sometimes requires breaking a rule, and that building a life requires mending a broken heart, both the physical and the emotional kind. The system had judged her, but in the end, it also made room for her unique truth, that the greatest medicine is sometimes not found in a protocol, but in the unwavering will to say, "This one is mine, and I will not let go." The story of Walter and Ilara Briggs forces us to confront a difficult question. Where is the true line between a crime and a miracle? The system, with all its necessary rules, labeled her act as one. But in the quiet of a recovery room, in the steady beat of a healed heart, it was undeniably the other. Their tale is not an argument for anarchy in medicine. It is a stark reminder that systems are built for the average case, for the typical path. But human beings and the love that binds them are never typical. Walter's choice in the hayloft was not legal, it was human. Ilara's choice at his bedside was not sanctioned, it was filial. Both were acts of radical responsibility taken in the vacuum of other options. We often celebrate stories of professionals who follow protocol to a brilliant result, but we are drawn, deeply and emotionally, to the stories of those who must bend the world to their will to save what they love. It speaks to a truth we all recognize, that the most important things in our lives often exist outside the boxes we are told to check. Ilara did not get the future she originally fought for. She forged a new one, in a role that perfectly marries the skills she proved that night with the compassion that drove it. Walter did not just get more years. He got to see the seed he planted not only grow, but become a shelter for others. The abandoned infant and the lonely farmer created a legacy that now extends to an entire community in need. Perhaps that is the final lesson. Our greatest triumphs are not always the ones we planned. They are the ones born from desperation, honed in adversity, and redeemed by a love that refuses to quit. The world may judge you by the rules you break, but your life will be measured by the bonds you keep. If this story of impossible choices and unwavering love resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to remember that miracles often wear the disguise of a desperate act. For more documentaries that explore the deepest bonds of the human heart, subscribe and join us for the next journey.